Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Governed by God, a biblical look at law, civics, and government. My name's Eric Leupold. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. So I'm excited about today because I get to talk about a topic that's probably on everybody's mind, and that is the topic of tariffs. All right, tariffs. Yes, what are tariffs, and how do they work? Are they good? Are they biblical? And what is some of the history behind the use of tariffs in the United States? I'm going to try to cover a lot of that today. I will say, though, that I am not an expert in economics. And I try to get a lot of my information. I just do some research, or I have several podcasts I listen to that are economic podcasts. But I'll do the best I can to explain this topic. Now, just as a heads up, what I try to do when it comes to like a complicated topic, such as tariffs, I try to boil everything down to the simplest examples, and usually the family is a good level, for example, because a lot of things that happen in the broader society, they first kind of happen in the family, or there's a lot of parallels there because the family is like a miniature society. And hopefully, with the example that I use to explain how tariffs work, you'll see that. But to begin, what is a tariff? It's kind of funny that we're talking about that now because years ago, if you would have asked me what a tariff was, I would have been like, what are you talking about? And I doubt that many people even use that term or even knew about that term. But now that's all we talk about is tariffs. So it's just kind of funny. But the bottom line is that a tariff is a tax. Now, it's a specific kind of tax. It's a tax on imported goods. And it can be utilized for a variety of reasons. But the question always is, well, how exactly does it work? Who pays the tariff? And how does it relate to things like a trade deficit? So we'll try to work through that today. And what I want to do to try to help explain this is just give a simple story or an example at the family level. So let's say that my daughter decides that she wants to make and sell cookies. All right, so we use a cookie analogy. And so we encourage, entrepreneurship in our family. And so we agree that, well, my daughter can make cookies and she can sell them. And everyone, including her parents and her siblings, will have to pay for these cookies because she wants to make a little bit of money. So she sells the cookies for $1 a piece. And everybody has to pay that price, including myself, my son, my other daughter, my wife. Everyone's got to pay that. But then she decides that she wants to sell those cookies to our neighbors. All right, great. Everyone loves them. Everyone's paying for them. $1 a cookie. Wonderful, right? So then let's say that my neighbor across the street, his daughter wants to join in on the cookie business, wants to get in on some of this income. And her dad supports it. But what he does is he's able to get the price to 80 cents per cookie. Maybe he utilizes some unethical methods. Perhaps he makes all of his children work in the kitchen, but none of them see a profit. Only the daughter makes profit off of the cookies, and he can get the price lower to 80 cents per cookie. So whatever the reason, though, is that now my neighbor across the street is selling cookies at 80 cents per cookie. And they're roughly the same quality, maybe a little bit less quality, roughly the same quality. And now the neighbors, and even my own son, because, he wants cookies, and he used to buy his sister's cookies for $1 a piece. Well, you know what? There's an 80-cent cookie he can get. He's going to get that. So everyone starts to buy the neighbor's cookies. Now, my daughter starts to complain about this. So I decide, all right, well, you know what? I can't control what goes on in my neighbor's house, and I can't control anybody else's house, but I can control this house. So I'm going to put a tariff in place. All cookies coming in are 50% increase. I mean, I could say just cookies coming from my neighbor are 50%. I could just target him specifically, but we'll just go broad, and we'll say any cookies coming into my house are increased by 50%. And so if my neighbor wants to sell cookies at 80 cents a cookie, they really end up being about $1.20. All right. Now, we're just going to assume that my son can't, walk over to the neighbor's house and just get the cookie for 80 cents. We have to have at least a couple of assumptions here. So I'm just going to assume that the item, the cookies, have to come in through the front door. They have to be brought over by the neighbor. Okay? So now I put this tariff in place, and my son's a little frustrated because he was getting cookies from the neighbor at 80 cents a cookie. Now, because of this tariff, if he wants the neighbor's cookies, they're now $1.20. Or it's going to cost that much, right? It's going to cost more. So he could go back to paying the original $1 to buy his sister's cookies. Anyways, so how would this exactly work, this tariff? Who would actually pay it? It's not as simple as we would think. So let's just say that the neighbor's daughter comes over. She comes to the front door, knock, knock. I got some cookies to sell, 80 cents a cookie. Now I'm standing at the door because I'm angry, and I want to make sure that no one in my house is getting cheap cookies, getting these 80-cent cookies, I should say, from our neighbors. So I say 50% tariff. Okay, now the neighbor has a choice to make. The one selling the cookies, she could eat the entire cost herself. She could keep what my son pays at 80 cents, okay? But then in that case, she has to pay that tariff. Because it doesn't matter what happens. I don't really care who pays it. I'm getting the tariff. The tariff is coming to me. Now, maybe if she keeps the price low for my son, she keeps his business, right? But she has to pay that tariff. And it'll eat into her profits. And so that's not really sustainable, generally speaking. It's not sustainable. So usually the price will have to increase. Now, the person selling the cookies could increase the price so that their profits don't change. So I don't know what she was making. Maybe she was earning a profit of 60 cents for every cookie. So all she has to do is raise the price a little bit, and even though the tariff's in place, she gets the same amount of profit as before. Gets the 60 cents profit before. But then my son has to pay a higher price. So in that sense, he's eating the cost of the tariff. So it's not necessarily the case that only the person buying it, only my son in this scenario, is eating the cost of the tariff. No pun intended, right? Eats the cost. But it all depends. But generally speaking, the price typically has to go up for the person buying it. And that person has to bear the burden of the tariff. If my son wants the cookies from the neighbor, then the cost on him is going to be higher. And that's the intent is to disincentivize him so that he stops buying the neighbor's cookies and buys my daughter's cookies. We're going to keep the family cookie business going strong. And ultimately, my son gets frustrated because he has to pay more for cookies when he was getting them pretty cheap. So that analogy is just used to explain kind of who pays the tariff. And it kind of depends. Although it's usually the case that the person buying the item can't avoid paying more on prices. But let me change the analogy slightly. So let's say that the neighbor starts selling cheap cookies, 80 cents a cookie, but I never put a tariff in place. I don't do a tariff. All right, so what's going to happen? Well, people, unless they're specifically wanting to buy my daughter's cookies due to quality, perhaps, but let's say the quality is basically the same, then in general, people are going to want to buy the cheaper cookie. And you can't blame them for that. So my son, he's buying cheap cookies, not from his sister. He's buying it from the neighbor. So my daughter can't compete with that. And so she decides, you know what, I'm getting out of the cookie business. No more cookies. I'm not making them. I'm not selling them anymore. I'm done. I'm going to do something else. Maybe go do babysitting or something, maybe designing websites. I don't know. But let's go on the topic of trade deficits, because this kind of touches on that a little bit. I mean, really, a trade deficit is where you are bringing in, so to speak, you're bringing in goods and services, more goods and services than you are sending out. So now previously my daughter was making a lot of cookies and everyone was buying them. So she was bringing out a lot of cookies, sending out a lot of cookies, and we weren't bringing any in. So that was a huge export business. But then when the neighbor starts making cookies, all right, and my son starts to buy them, and people start to buy them, those neighbors' cookies instead of my daughter's, now the cookies that are being sold and going out of our house are trickling down, reducing. But the number of cookies coming in is a lot higher. So in that way, there's a trade deficit. We're bringing in more than we are sending out. Now, is it necessarily a bad thing to have a trade deficit? Is it inherently evil or bad for a country? And again, it's not a simple answer. The answer is it depends. It's not necessarily bad. And here's why. Perhaps my daughter is going to school and so temporarily stops making cookies because she is spending her time learning a new skill, learning a trade, getting a degree, so that later on she can make even more money doing a different job. So in that, 3 to 4 year period, in that period, no cookies are going out. No one is producing anything. We're just bringing stuff in. That would be a trade deficit. But is that like a horrible, terrible situation? No, it's not, right? A deficit is not inherently good or bad. It depends on the situation, okay? And it also depends, are you talking about a deficit between two nations or big picture looking at the entire globe, the entire world, everything coming in versus everything going out? But anyways, that's kind of just a brief aside on the trade deficit. So let's just go back and say that my daughter, she just gets out of the cookie business. She doesn't want to compete anymore. All right, so she's done. There's no more equipment for making cookies. We're just buying the neighbor's cookies. Everyone is. Okay. So now what happens if I decide I'm feeling nostalgic as a father. I really miss the days when my daughter made cookies and sold them and everyone came to our house to buy cookies and it was great. And I'm tired of seeing these neighbors' cookies coming in my house. So you know what? I'm putting a cookie tariff in place. That's it. So now 50% tariff, bam, right now. Okay, so I'm standing at the door and every time the neighbor comes over with cookies, I force the tariff and my son has to pay higher prices now. But here's the thing. He has no choice in this matter. See, previously, when my daughter was still making cookies, he didn't like the fact that he had to go from 80 cents to $1, but he did it and it was available, right? But now, we're not making any cookies in the Leupold house anymore. Not right now. So he has no option. He has to pay the higher price because there's no domestic cookie production going on. That's his only choice, is to pay for more expensive cookies. And that at the same time, my daughter has to decide, should she restart the cookie business? Because now it looks like there's an opportunity to make some money. But that's a decision that she has to make. Do I go back into making cookies? If I do, I will make some profit because, I can sell them for $1 a cookie, which her brother will buy. But then, will it be that much of a profit though? So maybe it's not worth it. Maybe it's not worth quitting school and going back in the cookie making business, or quitting whatever she was doing and going back into the cookie making business, right? And what's even worse in this situation is that if my daughter decides to go back into the cookie business, she's dependent upon the tariff. The tariff I put in place is what's supporting her. If it hadn't been for that tariff, she would be doing something else with her time and her productivity. But so now there's an artificial inflation going on here, an artificial increase in value of cookie production. And that's the reason why she's doing it, because I put a tariff in place. And if I hadn't done that, she'd be continuing with what she was doing. So I'm putting my finger on the scale, and I'm artificially incentivizing domestic in-house cookie production. But maybe that wasn't worth it though. Maybe my daughter was doing something much more productive. And now she's not doing that new productive thing. She has to go back to making cookies, right? So the question is this tariff on cookies helping my house or not? It depends again. Probably not though, because it will bring in money. I'll earn tariff money as long as my son decides to keep buying expensive, cookies from the neighbors. All right. As long as he keeps doing that, I'll make money. If he stops, if he decides, you know what, I'm just not going to eat cookies anymore. No more cookies. I'm going to eat, cucumbers. If he stops eating cookies, then the tariff stops too. He's not buying them anymore. And if my daughter goes back in the cookie business, and presumably she's going to be able to sell her cookies at a lower price than the tariff, then my son will start buying her cookies, and he won't be buying the neighbor's cookies. And so guess what? No more tariffs for me. So it kind of is not really much of an income stream unless people continue to buy the neighbor's goods. So now the question comes in, are tariffs good things? Can they be good things? And again, I hate to say it, but the answer is it depends. It can be a way to bring in income. And in fact, it's one of the primary sources of income for the United States prior to the income tax, which was in 1913. The first, I guess you could say, permanent or legal, unchallenged income tax. So tariff was a primary source of income for the United States. It was also a source of strife between the agricultural and slave states of the South and the industrial states of the North and the New England states. Okay, so it did cause a lot of strife and angst there. It wasn't the sole cause of the Civil War or even the primary cause, but it certainly contributed. It did not help things. It can also be a negotiating tool, tariffs can be, because you can try to force other nations to play fair or play by the rules. Like I said earlier, what if my neighbor is using unethical methods, child slave labor, to bring the price of those cookies down to 80 cents a cookie? I can put a tariff in place because I think that's wrong. I want to make him play by the rules. We're not going to use child slave labor on this project here. So you can use a tariff to do that. Or you can use a tariff to try to get the other person to stop tariffing your goods, right? If you want to make him adopt more of a free trade position, hey, if you're going to tariff me, I'm going to tariff you, but let's not do that. Let's try to come back to a free trade agreement. You can also use a tariff, kind of like an economic sanction, to make someone do something that you want them to do. Maybe that's keep a promise that they made, or stop doing something bad that you don't like, right? So in the example I gave above, my very first example, where I put a tariff in place to protect my daughter's cookie business, that was a protective tariff. The purpose of that tariff was not really for me to make money. That's not why I did it. I mean, I made some money, but the primary reason was to strengthen my daughter's cookie business and to make sure that she didn't lose out on profits as best as possible, right? But that's just one reason to use a tariff. It doesn't have to be protective. Okay, but in that case it was. So now that we've gone through that short example of the cookie family business, I want to take a look at the history, a brief history of tariffs and the income tax. I think this is going to blow your mind, honestly. I want to do this because I know a lot of podcasts talk about tariffs, and maybe some of them hit on the history behind it, but I just want you to see how far we've fallen as a country. I just want you to see that. So I'm getting a lot of my data from an article written by Sheldon Pollock from the journal The Tax Lawyer, and he wrote this article in 2013. It's called The Origin of the Income Tax, or Origins of the Income Tax. Now, this is quite fascinating. So before the American Civil War, the tariff typically strengthened the New England states, the northern, more manufacturing-heavy states, and it hurt the southern states, the slave states, because they were primarily focused on agriculture. So the southern states were exporting products like cotton and tobacco, but they had to import manufactured goods, and they wanted to import cheaper manufactured goods from Europe. But the tariffs that the federal government put in place made that more expensive. So it raised the prices, essentially, on the southern states, and it didn't hurt at all the northern states because they were still getting the cotton and the tobacco very, very cheaply. And they forced the southern states to pay for increased prices in manufactured goods. So the southern states were not happy about that. So there's a lot we could go into about the battles back and forth on the tariff. But anyways, from a federal budget perspective, let's go after the Civil War. From 1866 to 1893, tariff revenue alone exceeded the federal spending. So the federal budget made a profit or was positive for over 25 years. Every year for over 25 years, the federal government brought in more money than it spent, and that was without an income tax. It was without an income tax. There was no income tax. And the federal government had a balanced budget for a quarter century with no income tax. That is amazing. Man, I wish that we could go back to that, quite honestly. That doesn't mean that things were perfect, but that's a pretty good situation there. Now, in the 1880s and 1890s, there were very high tariffs because this wasn't just a means of protecting American industries. It was a means of funding the federal government, all right? Now, some of these tariffs were really, really high. So, for example, there was a tariff on wool as high as 50% tariff, okay? And most of the time, tariffs were advocated for by the Republicans in the North, and they were opposed by the Democrats in the South. Again, it's the agriculture versus the industrial parts of the country. But furthermore, the socialists, the ones that were pro-socialism, quasi-Marxism, they also hated tariffs because they believed that it brought about economic inequality, okay? And so the socialists advocated for a progressive income tax. They wanted to stop doing tariffs or to at least reduce the tariffs and supplement that with an income tax, all right? So opposition to tariffs grew and grew and grew. There were some reforms that were made in the 1880s and 90s, early 1900s. One of the reforms was they repealed the sugar tariff, but that caused a huge drop in revenue that the federal government was taking in because, well, sugar was, for the most part, not being produced in the United States. You had to kind of get it from overseas. So when that tariff went away, a good chunk of income from the federal government went away. What's interesting is that this article mentions how the New York Times argued that if they had to choose between a tariff and an income tax, they would choose a tariff. But they preferred neither. Ideally, they wanted neither. That's the New York Times in the early 1900s, right? They've fallen far, so to speak, since then. Now, when I say income tax, hear me now. You're gonna laugh when you hear this. Even the socialists that were pushing for an income tax advocated for a maximum of 2% at the highest level. 2% income tax at the highest level. Now, initially, Congress did pass an income tax in 1894, but it was deemed unconstitutional because the Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution as saying that it did not authorize the federal government to do a direct income tax on American citizens. And so that's where they began to push for an amendment to the Constitution, which ends up being the 16th Amendment. But the push for this started in 1909, and of course, like any amendment to the Constitution, it required 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. I cannot imagine how that got ratified. but it did. And I think one of the selling points was people hated tariffs so much, but also the promise of the income tax was so small. Like it was only supposed to be a few percentage points of your income and only on the wealthiest individuals. And I'll show you what the very first income tax was. But anyways, so they started in 1909. Congress approved the amendment, 2/3 of Congress. But they only got the final state that they needed, which was Delaware, in 1913. So it took about 4 years to get all the states, or at least 3/4 of the states, to ratify it and to say yes. And once they did that, once they got the constitutional amendment that allows the federal government to impose an income tax, the first income tax that wasn't shot down by the Supreme Court was passed in 1913. Now get this. This is the income tax. All right, I want to read this to you. Anyone making less than $3,000 a year at the time was exempt. No income tax. That would be equivalent to making around $100,000 today. So imagine anyone making $100,000 or less in the United States, no income tax. But even if you made more than that, so if you made more than $3,000 per year, you paid 1%. 1% of your income. That's it. Now, it rose to 2% if you made $20,000 per year. Now, in today's money, that would be $650,000. If you made $650,000, you only paid 2% of your income in taxes. Then it rose to 6% if you made $500,000 a year in 1913, which is equivalent to $16 million. So imagine if you made $16 million per year today, you only had to pay a 6% income tax. And then above that, it was 7%. So the highest. And even the wealthiest person, the Rockefellers or whoever, the wealthiest person had to pay only 7% income tax. Now, could you imagine that? That is the very first income tax. And hey, that sounds pretty good. I'd sign off on getting rid of the tariffs and having an income tax if it was that. But man, how far have we fallen? Can you imagine today if we had that kind of a tax structure? Well, now the bare minimum is 10%. That's the bare minimum. And it goes up to 37% at the highest levels. Anyways, let me now just go and finish by looking at, what does the Bible have to say about tariffs? Well, in my study of Scripture, I have not found any indication where God's law either allows for it or commands the imposition of tariffs. The only kind of tax you see in Israel is the poll tax or the head tax. So it's the half shekel tax that every man was supposed to pay. I think every man aged 20 or older had to pay every year. And that's it. All right. They didn't have, certainly didn't have an income tax or a property tax. And I think that those would have been viewed as evil because, well, you can't tax the land. The government doesn't own the land. And taxing someone's income, again, these are all things that only God can require. God requires the tithe and the offering from the produce of one's land or from the income in one's household. These are all things that God requires. And so it is an act of hubris and a form of idolatry for the government, the civil government, to usurp the role of God in that place. So anyways, the biblical model seems to be that really it's just a head tax, a tax on that each person pays once per year. It is not very much, a half shekel. Like that was not much money in those days. It was low enough that everybody could pay it, and it was low enough that it would not be a burden to people to pay. Now, someone today might say, "Well, that's ridiculous. Like you can't run a country like that." Well, just consider how far we've fallen. Like, if I were to tell you that we had an income tax of 1%, people would be like, you can't run a government off of that. Or how about if I told you that we could run the government with just tariffs, no income tax? People would be like, well, what about the roads? What about the fire department and the police and the military and all the things. Then what about this? What about that? But let me tell you, the federal government ran a budget surplus for a quarter century from 1866 to 1893 without the income tax. Without the income tax. How did they do it? And it's not like we didn't have industry or a quasi-modern military. I mean, the machine gun had been invented. We had ironclad naval vessels, right? They were introduced during the Civil War. The end of the Civil War had the first Gatling gun. So we had machine guns. We had the first machine guns going on there. We had ironclad warships. And soon we were going to have fully steel warships like battleships. Okay, we had artillery. All right, you had the infantry with rifled weapons. You had trains to transport troops to and from the battlefield. So we had a modernized industrial military. It wasn't like the old days of just swords and shields kind of thing. So I mean, we say that things have the modern nation requires so much more money. The modern government requires so much money. That's baloney. That is just not true. And it's just really sad that today the government, with trillions of dollars in revenue, with huge income taxes, can't balance its budget. It can't have a budget surplus. It's absolutely ridiculous. So we should be concerned, honestly, as a people. We should be very concerned. And that's why the idea of a federal government running without an income tax is ludicrous to us. And that's why the biblical model of the head tax is also ludicrous to us. We think it's crazy. But if we put ourselves in the shoes of our ancestors, they'll think that what we're doing is crazy. They'll think, whoa, you need a government that big? Are you serious? Like even the people that ratified the 16th Amendment for the income tax in 1913, even those individuals, if you were to tell them, that the current income tax is baseline 10%, I think they would have thought we were nuts. And they probably would have be breaking down in tears at the size of our government today. And the fact that with an income tax, you can't balance your budget? Seriously? What's wrong with you people? So I think all of us should be deeply concerned about the state of our nation right now, the state of our federal government, that we can't balance our budget. And, if we were to impose tariffs and get rid of the income tax, sure, I would call that a win. I would say that's a step in the right direction. But the way it looks right now, honestly, I mean, I like a lot of what President Trump is doing. I really do. But if you're not going to reduce the income tax, if you're just going to add tariffs, and you're not going to alleviate the income tax in any way, then that's just only going to make things worse. And it's going to give the government more money that they're going to spend unwisely, and they're not going to balance the budget. Like, you have to stop the spending, and you have to reduce the income tax. That's really the only way forward I see, if we're going to find a place for tariffs. But anyways, I want to end today kind of on a downer, but it should be something that causes us to be humble and to repent and to ask for God's mercy. Because I want to end with the words from 1 Samuel chapter 8, where Samuel warns the people of Israel about wanting a king like the other nations. And I've read this passage before, but it needs to be read again and again until there's massive repentance and revival going on in our country. But here are the words that Samuel said to the people of Israel when they wanted a king. Starting in verse 11, he said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the 10th of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take the 10th of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. So let's allow those words to sink in as we end today's episode. So I hope that you will consider these things carefully. I hope that you will pray for our nation as we have fallen so far from even 100 years ago, and certainly from the biblical model for what a government should be doing. And I hope that you found this episode informative and useful, and that you will join me again next time. So until then, take care.